An elderly widow offers shelter to 20 freezing bikers. The next morning, 1,000 Hell's Angels stop outside her door. The night tore through the landscape with a relentless, biting fury. Cold winds howled, rattling the aged shutters of a lonely farmhouse that stood isolated at the very edge of town, a solitary sentinel against the encroaching darkness. Inside, a single lamp cast a weak, golden pool of light, struggling to push back the oppressive gloom. Martha, an elderly widow, childless and burdened by a mountain of debt, felt frail and weary, a lifetime of silence settling heavy in her bones. She stood by her window, a worn shawl clutched tightly around her, listening to the storm's savage lament outside. It had been 15 long years since her husband Henry had passed away, leaving her to shoulder a house far too grand for one, a silence too profound, and a life that seemed to shrink with each passing season, fading into an indistinct echo of what it once was. Yet, on this particular night, the sound that pierced her desolate solitude was not merely the mournful cry of the wind, but a desperate guttural roar, the struggling engines of motorcycles battling against the unforgiving cold. 20 men, their leather jackets glistening with frozen sleet, their faces stark and blue with exposure, stood shivering at her gate, spectral figures in the swirling snow. Martha hesitated, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Who were these men? What if danger, stark and malevolent, shadowed their every step and sought entry into her fragile world? But in the end, the ingrained warmth of human kindness, a flicker she thought long extinguished, outshone the cold grip of fear. With a tremulous hand, she reached for the latch. Even with so little left to give, she found she simply could not turn them away. She had no way of knowing then, as the last of them shuffled across her threshold, that by dawn, her forgotten farmhouse, perched precariously on the precipice of her quiet existence, would stand at the epicenter of a roar unlike anything her hushed town had ever heard. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, please let us know where you are watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The night deepened into a bitter, merciless cold, a chill that sank deep into the very marrow of one's bones and rattled every loose shutter on Martha's aging farmhouse. Inside, hunched by the small, flickering lamp, Martha sat, her worn shawl drawn tight against her shoulders like a second skin. The house was silent, achingly so. 15 years had become an eternity since her beloved husband, Henry, had died. The rooms that once resonated with the easy melody of laughter had long since succumbed to an echoing quiet, a stillness that had become her constant, oppressive companion. There were no children to return home, no vibrant voices to break the endless quiet, just her, a growing pile of unpaid bills mocking her from the kitchen table, and the gnawing, ever-present fear that the bank might one day reclaim the pitiful remnants of her life. Martha had never envisioned her existence narrowing to this. A woman alone, drowning slowly in a sea of debt, the world forgetting her existence one desolate season at a time. And yet, despite the crushing weight of it all, she carried herself with a quiet, almost defiant, resilience. Her days followed a rhythm so steady it had bordered on ritual, a desperate attempt to impose order on a life that felt increasingly chaotic. She rose before dawn, boiled water for her morning tea, and sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the same vista Henry had once cherished, the field stretching infinitely beyond the frostbitten glass, a canvas of changing seasons. She would feed the hungry birds, tend to the few struggling plants that stubbornly survived in her neglected garden, and then retreat indoors, where time moved in slow, heavy steps, each tick of the clock a tangible weight. Neighbors drove past her property without so much as a glance, their cars kicking up dust or snow without slowing. They knew who she was, a fixture of the local landscape, but rarely did anyone call, much less stop. Some whispered that she preferred it that way, a solitary widow clinging fiercely to fading memories rather than the unpredictable ebb and flow of human interaction. Others, less kind, murmured that her profound sadness made conversation too heavy, too uncomfortable, as though they feared her loneliness might be contagious if they lingered too long. And so, the visits dwindled to nothing, and her name, once a familiar sound, faded from the lips of the community around her, becoming a forgotten echo. But Martha did not complain, not aloud. She carried her solitude not as a burden, but as if it were an intrinsic part of her being, a companion as familiar and inescapable as her own reflection in the windowpane. When night descended, a velvet curtain drawn across the sky, she would sit by the sputtering fire in Henry's old armchair, her hands clutching a worn shawl he had bought her at a county fair so many years ago. The fabric was frayed now, but it still held the faint, comforting scent of cedar. Sometimes, in the deepest quiet, she would whisper his name, a soft invocation, as if the very walls might carry the sound to wherever he had gone. Outside, a storm was gathering its formidable strength. The first lazy flakes of snow began to drift, delicate at first, but the air carried the sharp, ominous edge of something far heavier, something relentless and unyielding. The wind, now a predatory claw, tore at the shutters, and the chimney groaned with a sound like a wounded beast, as if straining under the sheer force of nature's brutal breath. It was the kind of storm that compelled travelers to quicken their pace, that made families huddle closer indoors, seeking solace in warmth and proximity, that made the roads perilous and the night truly cruel. For Martha, it was yet another stark, unforgiving reminder of how utterly vulnerable she was in this vast, empty house, so easily swallowed by the elements. The storm outside thickened, cloaking the house in a suffocating veil of snow, an impenetrable shroud. The shutters banged like distant, frantic drums, and Martha instinctively drew her shawl tighter, a meager defense. It was a night like many others she had endured, lonely, weary, filled with the resonant echoes of memory, and yet, something stirred in the air, a nascent tremor she could not quite name. The farmhouse, a fragile bastion, stood exposed against the primal howl of the wind, but what was truly coming would not be carried by the storm alone. The storm had swallowed the entire night, a ravenous maw devouring light and sound. Snow lashed across the fields like countless shards of glass, stinging the darkness, and the lonely farmhouse groaned and creaked beneath the relentless weight of the wind's assault. Inside, Martha sat rooted in her armchair, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, listening to the storm with the weary patience of a woman who had weathered countless winters. She thought she knew these sounds intimately, the mournful whine of the wind, the sharp crack of a distant branch, the restless, ancient groan of the earth beneath her feet. But then it came. At first, she mistook it for thunder, a low, rolling growl beneath the cacophony of the storm. But it did not fade. Instead, it grew steadily louder, stronger, deeper, as though the very ground itself was trembling, shuddering under some immense, approaching weight. She leaned closer to the window, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm she was loath to admit. Through the blurring veil of snow and darkness, faint pinpricks of light appeared, weaving and bouncing, multiplying with astonishing speed. 1 became 5, then 5 became 10, then a full score of 20. Headlights, piercing through the storm like fiery, predatory eyes in the desolate night. Engines. The sound pressed against her very walls, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and shook the glass in its frame. Martha froze, her breath catching painfully in her chest. Motorcycles. Here, at the farthest, most forgotten edge of town, in the heart of a raging blizzard. It made no sense, defied all logic. Yet there they were, 20 dark figures, leather-clad, soaked to the bone. Their bikes huddled together like weary beasts seeking desperate shelter. The air outside seemed to shiver with their arrival. A palpable tremor of anticipation and unease. The riders dismounted, their heavy boots sinking deep into the pristine snow. They stood illuminated in the harsh glow of their own headlights, steam rising visibly from engines that fought a valiant, losing battle against the encroaching cold. Their faces were obscured, shadowed beneath helmets and scarves, but their bodies told a clear story. Shoulders hunched, arms clutched defensively against the brutal cold, movement stiff with profound exhaustion. These were not men embarking on a joyous ride. These were travelers stranded, caught in a monstrous storm that threatened to consume them entirely. Martha's breath fogged the glass as she peered through the tattered curtain, her chest tightening with an icy knot of dread. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. She was alone, utterly fragile, with nothing but a flimsy lock and a worn wooden door separating her from 20 imposing strangers. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. Who were they, these dark figures? Where had they come from, appearing like specters from the storm? Why her gate, her isolated house, her quiet, insignificant world? Then came the knock. Slow, heavy, a muffled fist against wood, softened by the storm's roar but utterly unmistakable. Once, twice, 3 times. Martha did not move, paralyzed by an instinctual terror. The second series of knocks followed, louder, more insistent, carrying a weight that made her flinch, a sudden involuntary spasm. She clutched her shawl tighter, her fingers trembling violently against the rough fabric. Her eyes darted instinctively to the old, rotary telephone on the wall. Should she call the sheriff? Would anyone even dare venture out through such a storm in time? Or would she be left to face whatever stood at her door, utterly alone? The knock came again, a forceful demand. This time, a voice followed it, deep, rough, yet strangely steady, carrying just enough through the wind to be decipherable. Ma'am, please, we're freezing out here. She hesitated, an agonizing moment, torn between a primal instinct for self-preservation and a profound, unsettling compassion. Every caution she had ever learned, every whispered warning about strangers, screamed at her to stay behind the sturdy lock, to let the storm mercifully swallow them, to protect herself from whatever unknown danger might rush in if she dared to open that door. And yet, another sound rose inside her, distinct from the howling storm and the pleading men outside. It was a memory, Henry's voice, clear and resonant, as if he were standing right beside her once more, his hand warm upon her shoulder. Always help the traveler, Martha. He had told her long ago, his eyes full of earnest conviction. Asterisk, even if he looks like an enemy, the road changes a man. Sometimes all he needs is a place to rest. She swallowed hard, the immense weight of his words pressing down on her fear, momentarily crushing it. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her armchair. Her knees ached with the effort as she crossed the wooden floor, each step echoing with unnatural loudness in the profound silence. At the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the cold latch, a feather's breadth away from commitment. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath, carrying with it the low rumble of idling engines and the murmured voices of 20 men, waiting, frozen in suspended animation. She could feel the relentless cold seeping in through the cracks, biting at her skin as if to remind her of the brutal ordeal they must be enduring. A palpable desperation clung to the air, thick and suffocating. Still, doubt lingered, a venomous serpent coiling in her gut. What if true danger walked in with them, masked by the storm? What if opening this door meant she would never live to see another sunrise? Her trembling fingers finally touched the icy latch. For a fleeting moment, she closed her eyes. She saw Henry's warm, reassuring smile, felt the familiar strength of his hand in hers, heard once more his quiet, unwavering faith in people, even strangers. The memory, a tender ghost, steadied her trembling. With a breath as fragile as it was brave, Martha turned the latch and pulled open the heavy door. Snow and wind rushed inside, a swirling vortex, wrapping around her shawl, biting at her exposed skin. Beyond the threshold stood a figure, tall and broad, his formidable leather jacket soaked through, his rugged beard frozen with countless shards of ice. He slowly removed his helmet, revealing tired eyes that, despite their inherent roughness and the harshness etched into their depths, carried a glimmer of something deeply human, a flicker of raw vulnerability. He bowed his head slightly, almost deferentially, a gesture of unexpected respect, and spoke again, his voice now clearer, less strained. Please, ma'am, we don't mean trouble, just warmth. Behind him, the others stood, shivering uncontrollably, their breath rising in ghostly clouds, their bodies heavy with bone-deep fatigue. For a moment, the storm itself seemed to hold its breath, hushed by the profound gravity of the moment. And in that frozen instant, Martha made her unwavering choice. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of silence, swallowed them one by one, 20 towering strangers stepping across her worn threshold, bringing with them the bitter bite of the storm and the ingrained grit of the open road. Martha stood aside, her heart pounding a frantic drum beneath her shawl, as the leader, a silent giant, motioned for the others to enter. Their heavy boots hit the aged wooden floor with a resounding thud that echoed ominously through the small house. Snow and slush, clinging to their boots, pooled by the door, melting into dark, muddy puddles. The pungent smell of wet leather and gasoline, raw and wild, filled the air, clashing sharply with the faint, comforting scent of old cedar and brewing tea that usually permeated her home. For Martha, this sudden invasion of her quiet sanctuary was an overwhelming, almost suffocating, assault on her senses. For the bikers, however, it was an undeniable salvation. They moved cautiously, shoulders brushing against one another in the narrow hallway, helmets pulled away to reveal faces deeply worn by the relentless wind, etched with lines and scars from years of hard, unforgiving living. Some nodded at her as they passed, murmuring a low, almost guttural, "Thank you, ma'am," their voices hoarse and raw from the cold. Others said nothing at all, their eyes darting swiftly around the room, scanning the unfamiliar walls, the faded photographs, and the small, trembling woman herself, as though calculating precisely where they had landed and what sort of extraordinary soul had opened her door to their disheveled band. Martha's hand lingered on the latch even after she had pulled the door shut, a silent plea for its security. She could hear the storm battering relentlessly against the windows, desperate, it seemed, to claw its way back inside. But the storm was no longer her greatest worry. It was these men, shedding their soaked jackets, unbuckling gloves stiff with frost, shaking off the night's relentless cruelty in her very living room. Leather jackets hung heavy and dripping on the backs of her treasured chairs. Boots, caked with snow and mud, were stamped near the roaring fire, sending water droplets hissing dramatically against the crackling wood. The old farmhouse groaned, a living entity, beneath the sheer weight of so many large, imposing bodies, men too vast for its small, intimate rooms. Their raw, masculine presence swallowed the profound silence that had been her only companion for so long, suffocating it completely. Martha's breath caught in her throat as she truly looked at them. Their intricate tattoos, their jagged scars, the profound hardness etched into every feature of their weathered faces. It all spoke of lives lived precariously at the very edge of society, far removed from the gentle rhythms of farmhouses and quiet kitchens. And yet, beneath that formidable armor of leather and steel, she also saw the deep weariness, the shivering hands, the raw red skin chapped mercilessly by the storm. They were dangerous, perhaps, yes, but they were also undeniably profoundly human. Still, a palpable tension clung to the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Two of the men whispered intently to each other in a far corner, their voices low and conspiratorial, their eyes flicking suspiciously toward the closed door, as if still unsure whether to fully trust the precarious shelter they had found. One sat with his arms folded tight across his chest, glaring defiantly at the fire as though daring it to warm his frozen core. Yet another crouched low by the hearth, hands stretched out hungrily toward the dancing flames, tears forming unbidden in his eyes as the blessed heat slowly returned to his numb skin. Gratitude and suspicion, two opposing forces, shared the same cramped space, pulling the air taut like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Martha steadied herself with a deep, shaky breath. She did the only thing she knew how to do, the simple, practical acts her hands had always performed in times of fear or uncertainty. She went to the kitchen. The soft scuff of her small footsteps echoed with unnatural loudness against the heavy thud of their boots behind her. She pulled a worn pot from the cupboard, filled it with fresh water from the pump, and set it carefully on the old stove. Her hands trembled, but they did not falter, a testament to years of quiet, steady labor. Bread. She had baked 2 loaves the morning before, a lingering habit from a time when she still expected visitors, a time before the silence. She sliced them with slow, deliberate precision, her knife gliding smoothly through the crust. Butter, kept wonderfully cool by the pervasive winter air, softened obligingly in the warmth of her hands. She laid out what little she had, plain and humble offerings, and the comforting scent of it drifted into the living room like a sweet, phantom memory of gentler, more bountiful times. One by one, the men looked toward the kitchen, drawn by the irresistible aroma. They shifted restlessly in their seats, their hardened expressions softening, just infinitesimally, as the fragrance reached them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, hunger began to overcome suspicion. Martha ladled steaming, thin soup into chipped bowls, the broth simple but hot, and carried them into the room, her small frame moving among their larger ones. The men accepted them with hands that still shook, not from anger or defiance, but from the brutal combination of cold and profound need. A murmured, "God bless you," rose from one corner, rough and heartfelt. A quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," from another, equally sincere. Gratitude, awkward and deeply restrained, yet undeniably real, began to permeate the tense air. Yet still, a few remained resolutely silent, their eyes watchful, their posture stiff and guarded. They accepted her kindness as if it were a forced transaction rather than a freely given gift, as if true trust could not be purchased with mere bread and soup alone. Martha noticed, but she did not judge. She had learned long ago, through years of quiet observation, that appearances rarely, if ever, told the whole complex story. Her thoughts drifted backward, beyond the storm, beyond these intimidating strangers, to another time, another man. Henry. She saw him vividly in his uniform, standing tall and proud in photographs now yellowed with the relentless march of age. Her husband had been a soldier, a man of war, before he was her devoted companion. He had known war, known true hardship, known the razor's edge of survival intimately. He had told her once, his eyes distant and haunted by memories, that the fiercest faces often concealed the kindest souls, that a man who looked like an enemy might one day, unexpectedly, save your very life. It was that profound memory, that quiet wisdom, that now steadied her trembling hands. As she moved from man to man, offering what little she had, her gaze met theirs, and in each weary eye, she remembered Henry's quiet lessons. Asterisk, do not let fear blind you. Do not mistake roughness for cruelty. Do not forget that every stranger carries a story you do not know, a hidden landscape of experience. Asterisk, the farmhouse, once hollow with the resonance of silence, now hummed with a fragile, uneasy life. The storm outside roared its relentless fury, but within these sheltering walls, another, more subtle storm brewed, one of suspicion delicately balanced against profound gratitude, a fear slowly tempered by unexpected mercy. The night stretched on, an eternity, the storm outside clawing at the walls as if determined to remind everyone in that precarious house that winter, in its essence, was merciless. Inside, the fire cracked and hissed, a living entity, spitting sparks like angry jewels against the cold stone hearth, its warm, flickering glow painting faces that were equal parts weary and wary. The room was crowded now, a tapestry of humanity, with heavy leather jackets draped over every available chair, muddy boots lined in a messy row that further marred her pristine wooden floor, and the oppressive heavy silence of men who had learned, through hard experience, not to trust the easy kindness of strangers. But slowly, almost reluctantly, that rigid silence began to fracture, like ice cracking under pressure. One of the younger bikers, his face drawn and pale with exhaustion and cold, let slip the harrowing story of their night. Their convoy had been strong, a formidable wall of roaring engines tearing across the interstate when they had first set out, full of swagger. But the storm, a malevolent force, had scattered them without mercy. Some had wisely turned back, retreating from the storm's wrath. Others, less fortunate, had simply been swallowed by the encroaching cold in the desolate distance, their fates unknown. These 20, however, had pressed forward, driven by a primal need for survival, until the very road itself seemed to vanish beneath the deepening snow, and desperate, bone-deep exhaustion drove them inexorably toward the faint, welcoming light glowing in Martha's window, a beacon in the storm. Martha listened carefully, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the fire. She saw beyond the hardened bravado of the leather and the chains, beyond the rough exteriors. She saw men whose shoulders carried burdens far heavier than the storm itself. One man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and she caught a fleeting glimpse of dark bruises that snaked up his arm, fading purple against his pale, exposed skin. Another winced perceptibly as he bent forward, exhaustion painted in the deep, weary lines beneath his eyes. These were not men untouched by struggle. They were carved by it, shaped by its relentless hand. For a moment, her mind drifted backward, back to the distant years when her Henry wore his army uniform, his shoulders squared, his eyes shadowed by untold things he never fully shared, battles fought within. He used to tell her, his voice low and solemn, that life on the road, or in the field, stripped men bare, exposing their raw, fundamental truth. It was in hardship, he had insisted, that one truly saw a man's character, not in how they looked or the armor they wore, but in how they carried the immense weight laid upon them. Martha remembered those profound words now, seeing past the rough, intimidating exteriors before her, into the weary souls within. Across the crowded room, the leader sat slightly apart, his back straight, his presence commanding without a single uttered word. His eyes were sharp, intensely watchful, taking in every minute movement, every subtle flicker of expression. Martha found herself meeting his gaze more than once, drawn by an unspoken current. And though his face gave little away, a carefully constructed mask, there was something there, something that softened ever so slightly when she offered another slice of bread, or when her trembling hand gently set down a fresh cup of steaming broth before one of his men. Later, when the fire had burned lower, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the room, Martha found herself in the kitchen, silently refilling a pot with water. The leader had followed her, his heavy boots landing surprisingly softly on the old wooden planks, a testament to his deliberate control. He said little, but when he did, his voice was lower than she had expected, edged not with an overt threat, but with the quiet, authoritative calm of a man utterly accustomed to command. He thanked her, not in grand, sweeping words, but in the brief, profound sincerity of someone who did not offer gratitude lightly, a rare and precious commodity. For the first time since opening her door, Martha felt the faint, fragile trace of mutual respect pass between them, an invisible bridge spanning the chasm of their differences. Yet not all eyes in that house were softened by warmth or gratitude. At the very edges of the firelight's embrace, whispers coiled, insidious as smoke, between some of the men. Their voices were hushed, barely audible, but not lost entirely, laced with a familiar suspicion. Questions, sharp and probing, rose in the close air. Who was this elderly woman to open her home to them so freely, so completely? What did she truly want in return for such boundless, unexpected generosity? Could kindness, pure and unadulterated, truly be trusted in a brutal world where betrayal was common currency, a ubiquitous threat? The storm raged louder outside, a deafening symphony of wind and snow, but it was the storm brewing inside, the thin, dangerous fracture of doubt among the bikers, that seemed to chill Martha most profoundly. She stood at the threshold of her own kitchen, feeling their assessing eyes on her back, burning into her, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she wondered if she had truly welcomed safety into her home, or something far, far more dangerous. The fire had settled into a steady, comforting glow, the kind of fire that did not shout or blaze with frantic energy, but breathed slow and steady, like the deep, rhythmic heartbeat of the room itself. Its gentle, amber light now reached into the farthest corners, softening the heavy shadows that had once loomed so oppressively over Martha's parlor, pushing back the lingering ghosts of loneliness. Smoke curled lazily up the chimney, a thin, fragrant wisp, carrying with it the sweet, familiar scent of charred oak and the damp wool of drying clothes arranged by the hearth. The air was thick with warmth now, a palpable comfort, but it was not only the fire's embrace that pushed back the penetrating cold. It was something else, something unseen yet deeply felt, a fragile thread that had begun to stir between the disparate strangers gathered there. Martha sat nearest the hearth, as if anchoring herself to the light, a small, fragile figure bathed in the golden glow. Her hands, worn and fragile with years of labor and worry, lay folded tightly in her lap, a silent testament to her enduring strength. She could hear everything, the soft shuffle of heavy boots as men shifted restlessly in their chairs, the low rumble of voices trading half-whispered words, hesitant and guarded, the familiar creak of the ancient wooden beams that had held her house together, defying time longer than she had been alone, a constant, comforting presence. Each sound carried its own peculiar weight, but none pressed on her chest as heavily as the profound silence she had carried, a crushing burden, for so many long years. And then, without quite intending to, without a conscious decision, she broke it. Her voice slipped into the room like a delicate thread of smoke, thin at first, uncertain, almost imperceptible, but utterly impossible to ignore. She told them about her husband, not just that he was gone, a simple fact, but who he had truly been before the world, with its relentless march of time and trials, had taken its inexorable toll. She spoke of how his infectious laughter used to roll, a joyful cascade, through these very rooms, how his vibrant presence had once filled the house so completely that even the stoic walls themselves had seemed to hum with the very pulse of life. And then, her voice softening, she told them of the war, of the endless, agonizing nights she had waited by the mailbox for letters that never seemed to arrive, of the mornings when the mail did come and her heart sank, a leaden weight, when none bore his familiar, beloved handwriting. She told them of the bittersweet day he finally returned, not entirely the bright, hopeful man she had kissed goodbye, but a quieter, heavier soul, one whose haunted eyes carried battles that no one else could ever truly see or comprehend. Her words wove through the firelight, trembling faintly but holding steady, carrying with them not just the raw ache of grief, but the powerful, cathartic force of years of profound silence finally breaking open. She confessed the deep, gnawing ache of waking each morning to an empty bed, of walking through rooms that once echoed with the vibrant sound of his footsteps, and now only with her own solitary ones. She spoke of dinners eaten alone, the plate across from her an agonizing reminder, of holidays spent staring at a chair that would never again be filled, a void that could not be bridged. She told them how Henry's unwavering support, his quiet strength, would undoubtedly have helped save her from the crushing weight of debt and the relentless decay of the dilapidated farmhouse she now inhabited, how his presence would have eased her profound loneliness and all the myriad sorrows that widows, like her, quietly endure. And when she admitted, her voice faltering with emotion, that she sometimes talked aloud to the very walls, just to hear a voice other than her own, a desperate plea against the silence, her voice almost broke. But she did not stop. The entire room shifted with the sheer force of her raw honesty. Men who had entered her home with hard, unyielding jaws and guarded, suspicious eyes now sat frozen, utterly captivated, listening with an almost reverent stillness. One rested his elbows on his knees, staring intently into the mesmerizing flames of the fire, as if its dancing light replayed his own deeply buried memories. Another leaned back, arms crossed tight against his chest, a self-imposed shield, though his face betrayed the inner struggle of a man desperately trying not to let emotion rise too freely to the surface. A younger one, whose intricate tattoos climbed his neck like dark, climbing ivy, rubbed at his eyes roughly, a transparent pretense that it was merely the smoke that stung them. The leader remained perfectly still, a silent, imposing figure, but his intense gaze was now fixed solely on Martha. Hours earlier, those eyes had been sharp and assessing, ready to measure threat in every shifting shadow. But now, they softened, not with pity, but with a profound, quiet recognition. He, too, it seemed, understood intimately what it was to lose, what it was to carry a silence that shouted louder, more agonizingly, than any noise. Then came the voices of the men, not loud, not boastful, but low and raw, each word pulled up like a heavy stone from deep, murky water. One spoke of a brother he'd lost overseas, his voice cracking with unbearable grief as he described the agonizingly empty chair at his mother's kitchen table. Another admitted, his voice barely a whisper, that he had never truly stopped hearing the terrifying echo of gunfire, even in the deepest recesses of sleep. A third told of endless, solitary nights on the road, when the silence grew so heavy and oppressive it felt like the crushing weight of a coffin pressing down on his chest, leaving him gasping desperately for air. Not all of their scars had been earned in uniform, in the crucible of war, but all were undeniably real, etched into their very souls. They spoke of broken families, of cherished friends buried far too young, of brothers who had turned to the open, unforgiving road not for rebellion, but for a desperate, fleeting refuge from pain. Beneath the intimidating tattoos and the formidable leather, beneath the roaring bravado of their engines and the carefully constructed armor of reputation, they were simply men, marked profoundly by the same grief, the same deep, aching loss that had carved itself so irrevocably into Martha's own solitary life. Veterans of war, survivors of profound loss, souls stitched together by pain and loyalty in equal measure, a testament to shared human experience. The fire became their silent witness, its comforting warmth loosening truths that the brutal world outside would never, could never, hear from them. In that humble parlor, words that had been buried deep under years of carefully constructed toughness and profound silence finally surfaced, fragile yet utterly undeniable. Martha listened intently, and with each raw, honest story, something deep inside her shifted. The crushing loneliness that had pressed on her for 15 long, desolate years did not vanish completely, but it began, imperceptibly, to ease. It was as though each man around that warm, flickering fire had reached out, in their own unspoken way, and taken a small, manageable piece of that immense burden from her shoulders, carrying it now, alongside their own equally heavy burdens. For the first time in over a decade, a profound realization settled upon Martha. She was not truly alone. The very walls of her old farmhouse, which had for so long echoed with a suffocating emptiness, now seemed to pulse with a new kind of life. They held not just the warmth of the fire, but the vibrant hum of voices, the raw texture of shared stories, and a strange, undeniable thread of kinship. A sense of belonging, fragile yet undeniably real, had found its way back into her life. Her gaze drifted upwards, drawn to the chipped wooden frame on the mantel where her husband's photograph stood. The dancing firelight caught the glass, making his stern, familiar face flicker as if alive. For years, that picture had been a silent wound, a constant, aching reminder of everything she had lost, a sentinel of grief. But tonight it felt profoundly different. There was no longer the sharp sting of absence, no dull throb of a heart left behind. Instead, she felt a powerful sense of presence, as though he were right there in the room with them, his eyes crinkling in quiet, approving acknowledgement of the unlikely company she had chosen to keep. The fire, as if sensing the shift, crackled with renewed vigor, its cheerful clamor momentarily eclipsing the mournful howl of the storm outside. Time itself seemed to lose its rigid edges, each hour blurring into the next until the night felt not merely long, but truly endless. The old farmhouse had transcended its simple function as a temporary refuge. It had become a sealed chamber, a sturdy vessel adrift in the tempest, carrying its unwilling passengers through a journey far deeper than mere travel. Within its protective shell, each soul was left to confront whatever raw truths the enveloping darkness might stir awake from their slumber. Martha remained by the hearth, her husband's photograph still catching the flame's warm embrace. She had placed it there earlier, almost an unconscious gesture, but now it seemed to preside over the gathering, the stoic face of a man long gone bearing silent witness to the unfolding drama. Her gaze lingered on his image, her lips parting in a breath that seemed to tremble on the very cusp of prayer and deeply cherished memory. Around her, the initial boisterousness of the bikers had faded after their earlier, tentative confessions. The storm and the fire had taken over, doing most of the talking, filling the gaps with their elemental voices. The soft, rhythmic tap of a boot against the floorboards, the almost imperceptible creak of a leather jacket as one man shifted his considerable weight, the stubborn, ticking march of the old clock on the mantel, these were the only sounds that broke the profound quiet. Then, a sound, sharp and unwelcome, brutally sliced through that fragile peace. It was not a casual clearing of the throat, but a ragged, tearing cough, wrenched from deep within a chest. Head snapped up, eyes wide with sudden concern. A second cough followed, harsher, more desperate, and a young man slumped forward in his chair, his broad shoulders hunching inward as if the very air had betrayed him. His breath came fast, uneven, a wheezing whistle like wind struggling through broken reeds. He tried to wave away their burgeoning concern, muttering weakly between gasps that he was fine, just fine, but his body faltered, an undeniable tremor running through him, and he nearly slid from his seat entirely. Panic, swift and scorching, rushed through the room like a sudden hungry flame. Boots scraped violently against the aged wooden floor. Chairs groaned under the abrupt movements. Voices tumbled over one another in a chaotic clamor of sharp, urgent orders and frightened, bewildered questions. The potent scent of worn leather, sweat, and wood smoke mingled, thick and acrid, in the sudden palpable chaos. But at the very heart of the maelstrom, Martha was already moving. Her small frame, usually stooped with the weight of years and bundled in a shawl that had certainly seen better days, rose with a surprising, almost alarming speed. "Space!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the din, carrying not the expected tremor of age, but the undeniable firmness of absolute command. The men, for all their rough edges and broad, imposing shoulders, instinctively fell back without a word of protest, stunned into silence by the sheer authority in her tone. She knelt beside the young man, her descent precise and unhurried. Her hands, crisscrossed with the prominent veins and stories of countless years, no longer trembled. They moved with an ancient, ingrained knowledge. These were hands that had bound gaping wounds on battlefield survivors, hands that had cradled feverish children through endless nights, hands that had steadied men broken by battles they could never bring themselves to speak of. These were the hands of a woman who had journeyed through sickness, through the brutal ravages of war, through the crushing weight of loss, and had somehow, miraculously, kept others alive in the very eye of the storm. Her fingers pressed lightly against his wrist, counting the frantic, hurried beats. She studied the uneven rise and fall of his chest, a keen, diagnostic gaze, then laid her palm against his forehead, feeling the alarming heat radiating there. With movements practiced long ago and honed by necessity, she reached for a simple enamel basin, poured water with steady, unwavering control, and then, without hesitation, tore a strip from an old, bleached sheet she kept folded in a forgotten trunk. She pressed the cool, damp cloth to his burning skin, a balm against the fever. The entire room held its breath, a collective pause in time. "Blankets," she stated, not as a polite request, but as an unequivocal command. One of the men, a giant of a fellow, fetched them instantly, as if on autopilot. "More space," she added, and the tightly packed circle around them widened further, giving her room to work. "Quiet," Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, flicked towards the louder, more restless ones, and even the most fidgety among them fell into a deep, respectful silence. From a shadowed corner, a biker muttered, his voice laced with a raw disbelief that bordered on awe. She knows what she's doing. Another whispered back, almost reverently, like she's done this 1,000 times before. The leader remained silent, a stoic figure, but his dark, watchful gaze never left her, tracking her every precise movement. And for the very first time that long, tumultuous night, the rigid lines of his expression softened, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, a fleeting glimpse of something profound. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour, the hands of the clock barely moving. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, clawing at the sturdy farmhouse walls. But inside, a more intimate battle was being waged. Breath against breath, the tenacious grip of life against the encroaching stillness of silence. Bit by bit, the young man's violent coughing eased, though his body still trembled uncontrollably with profound exhaustion. Martha gently propped him up with pillows, carefully spooned sips of water against his parched lips, and then, with a touch that transcended the clinical, laid her hand softly against his cheek. The gesture was not merely for comfort. It was tender, profoundly maternal, a silent promise of care. And in that singular, defining moment, every hardened man in the room saw her, truly saw her, in a completely new light. They had ridden in from the brutal cold, seeking only the temporary comfort of soup and fire, believing themselves the strong ones, the indomitable survivors, a brotherhood whose will could bend the world to its own design. Yet here, before their very eyes, was a slight widow whose strength outstripped them all, not in brute muscle or imposing might, but in the quiet, unwavering power of knowledge, in the unshakable steadiness of her resolve, and in a profound, unyielding love that rendered her utterly unafraid of hardship. She had, with nothing more than her unwavering presence, transformed chaos into calm, dispelled fear into a semblance of order, simply by being precisely what she was, unbroken. The respect that settled upon the room was unspoken, a thick, palpable presence, yet it was utterly undeniable. Shoulders that had been tense with suspicion now slumped with the sudden, welcome weight of relief. Jaws once clenched tight in distrust now loosened, their owners breathing more freely. And for the very first time that night, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the leader's formidable face. It was small, fleeting, a mere ghost of an expression, but it carried an immense weight. His men saw it, and that alone shifted the very air in the room more powerfully than any spoken words ever could. Still, beneath the fragile warmth of this newly forged peace, unanswered questions lingered, like embers glowing beneath ash. These men, scarred by life, hardened by the road, bound together by an unbreakable code, were clearly not simply drifters of the open highway. There was a palpable history etched into their silence, a deep-seated pain in the way their eyes darted and shifted, yet refused to speak. Martha could feel it, an ancient, familiar resonance, just as she had once felt the unspoken truths buried deep within her husband's silence after long, harrowing nights at war. There were stories, dark, complex narratives, buried beneath the rough leather and gleaming steel, stories that the gentle coaxing of the fire had not yet managed to draw out into the open. Outside, the storm continued its furious rage, rattling the ancient shutters as if demanding to be let in, to unleash its primal chaos upon them. But within those four walls, something fundamental had irrevocably shifted. They were no longer merely strangers caught in a shared storm. They had become participants in an enforced communion, a crucible of souls who had shared fear, offered tentative trust, and collectively walked the thin, perilous line between life and death. The fire, now a comforting presence, burned with a steady, rhythmic pulse, mirroring the beat of Martha's own heart. And as she finally sat back, the photograph of her husband glimmering softly at her side, she knew with a deep, intuitive certainty that the night was far, far from over. The storm, after hours of relentless howling and clawing at the house like a living, malevolent entity, had finally spent itself. Now, in its wake, there was only a profound silence, broken only by the occasional, almost musical groan of ice shifting and settling on the roof. Snow lay thick and unbroken across the vast, undulating fields, dazzling in the pale, nascent light of dawn. It was the kind of morning that radiated an almost ethereal peace, a stillness that felt holy, though Martha, with her lifetime of experience, knew well how utterly deceptive such quiet could be. Inside, the farmhouse still cradled the lingering warmth of the night before, a gentle ghost of heat. The fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing, exhausted embers, yet its heat persisted, weaving a faint, comforting scent of broth and ash through the air. Martha arose slowly, her joints stiff and protesting from a long night without sleep, but her resolve, as always, remained steady and unwavering. She moved towards the kitchen, her steps small but imbued with quiet purpose, and began her ingrained morning ritual. She cracked the last of her precious eggs into a well-worn skillet, carefully sliced what remained of her meager bread, and warmed milk on the stove until it steamed gently. It was not much, a humble offering, but to her, in this quiet, sacred space, the very act of feeding was a deeply hallowed rite. Behind her, the bikers began to stir, a slow awakening from uneasy rest. Boots thudded softly on the wooden floor, low voices murmured, and chairs scraped gently as men stretched away the night's cramped sleep. But the sharp tension, the wary suspicion of strangers was gone. Their movements now carried a subtle heaviness, an almost palpable humility. These were not marauders stealing themselves for the open road. They were guests, and they seemed to understand this new role with a profound, unspoken grace. When Martha called them to the table, they did not rush forward with the ravenous urgency of hungry men. Instead, they rose slowly, deliberately, falling into a quiet, almost disciplined line. 20 men in weathered leather, moving with a surprising, respectful order. One by one, they approached her, not as if entitled to the meal, but as if they understood with an acute awareness that it was a profound gift. "Thank you," murmured one, his voice unexpectedly gruff yet sincere. Another bowed his head slightly, a gesture that verged on reverence. "Ma'am," he said, the word emerging with a softness that seemed utterly incongruous with the intricate, menacing tattoos that crawled up his neck. Each offered words, few but heartfelt, a stark contrast to their previous silence. And each time, Martha simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, as if the thanks belonged not to her alone, but to something far greater, a universal spirit of kindness. She placed the food before them, her hands steadying against the slight, inevitable tremor of age, and in return, she received not suspicion, not menace, but a deep, abiding respect. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe it was finished, that the extraordinary night of strange company had culminated in nothing more than this. A shared fire, a humble meal, and a fragile, unspoken truce. Soon, they would ride off, disappearing back into the world, leaving her alone once more with her husband's photograph and her comforting, familiar silence. The thought brought with it a bittersweet relief. She did not fear their departure. Indeed, there was a part of her that longed for the return of her solitude. Yet, unexpectedly, she did not welcome it with the same wholehearted eagerness she once might have. The men ate quietly, a changed group. Their eyes no longer darted suspiciously, assessing every shadow, every potential threat. Their shoulders, once squared for battle, now carried something gentler, a subtle curve of ease. Gratitude, perhaps, or the profound calm that settles upon those who have been tested by a storm and miraculously spared. As Martha watched them, she found herself recalling her husband's quiet wisdom. Asterisk always help the traveler, even if he looks like an enemy. Asterisk she realized with a quiet certainty that she had lived that creed, and it had not failed her. But just as her heart began to settle into the comforting illusion of closure, she felt something stir again. Not outside, not yet. This time, the stirring was within the men themselves. A subtle shift, an unspoken attention she couldn't quite name. Their glances at the window were fewer, but when they came, they lingered, holding, as though listening for something beyond the farmhouse walls, something just beyond the range of ordinary hearing. Their silence now was not the silence of satisfied repose, but the taut, expectant silence of waiting. Martha noticed it, a faint prickle of unease, though she tried to dismiss it as merely her imagination. She set another plate down, wiped her hands on her apron, and consciously attempted to push the disquiet from her mind. After all, the storm was gone, vanquished. The sun was rising, painting the world in pale golds and rose. Surely the worst had passed. And yet, beneath the serene stillness of the snow-covered fields and the gentle crackle of the dying fire, there was something else, a nascent energy, a low hum she couldn't yet hear, but which the men, in their own inscrutable way, seemed to sense. It was as though the long night had not truly ended, but had merely paused, holding its collective breath, waiting for whatever was still to come. The morning air outside was brittle and sharp, each breath puffing a fragile cloud of white against the vast, clearing blue of the sky. Snow glittered across the fields like a boundless expanse of broken glass, pristine, untouched, and utterly still. Inside the farmhouse, Martha cleared the table with slow, deliberate movements, stacking plates, wiping stray crumbs with the corner of her apron. She could almost, for a fleeting moment, believe it had all been a dream. 20 burly bikers huddled around her fire, 20 hardened men humbly thanking her for humble bread and broth. But then it came. At first, it was only a faint vibration underfoot, so subtle she mistook it for the persistent quiver of her own old bones. But then the dishes on the counter rattled, a nervous clatter. The kerosene lamp, suspended from the ceiling, swayed gently, ominously. Her brow furrowed, a deeper crease forming on her aged skin. And then, from beyond the rolling, snow-dusted hills, the sound rose. Low, steady, relentlessly growing. It was not the wind. It was not the storm. It was a thunder far deeper, more primal, than nature itself. Engines. Hundreds of them. Martha froze, her hand instinctively pressing against the cold window frame. The sound swelled, multiplied, gathering strength, until it seemed the very earth beneath her feet was alive. A monstrous entity charging headlong towards her. The bikers inside stiffened, every head snapping towards the ominous sound with practiced speed. For a suspended moment, no one moved, caught in the sudden, deafening crescendo. The ancient floorboards trembled violently. The glasses on her shelf chimed against one another like a chorus of nervous, terrified bells. And then, cresting the distant rise beyond the field, they appeared. A vast, glittering river of chrome and steel, sunlight catching the polished tanks, handlebars flashing like an army of sharpened blades. 200 engines, then 3, then 400, a roaring, unified wave descending upon the narrow, winding road that led straight, inexorably, to her isolated home. Martha's breath caught, a ragged gasp trapped in her chest. The sight was almost unreal, an apocalyptic vision. An entire army on wheels, leather-clad figures leaning into the wind, the thunder of their collective arrival rolling across the valley like an act of God. It was power, raw and absolute, a storm not of nature, but of men and machines. Her knees suddenly weakened, threatening to buckle beneath her. For a terrifying heartbeat, she truly thought this was the end, that her kindness had, in the cruelest twist of fate, betrayed her, that her mercy had somehow invited doom itself upon her doorstep. She stumbled back from the window, one trembling hand rising to her lips, stifling a cry. Not just hundreds, but perhaps 1,000, she thought, a vast, unstoppable tide. They were not passing through, they were coming here. The ground outside quaked as the lead bikes, a formidable vanguard, swung directly into her gravel driveway. Snow sprayed up in blinding white plumes beneath their tires. Mud, thick and dark, churned beneath the crushing weight of their powerful machines. They did not stop at the edge of her property, a respectful boundary. Instead, they poured in, an unstoppable torrent, circling the farmhouse in a menacing, predatory swirl, engines snarling, chrome flashing like predatory teeth in the pale morning light. The sound hammered against her chest, pressed brutally against her skull, threatened to swallow her whole, to erase her very existence. Her quiet street, once forgotten by the world, now roared like a Roman Colosseum. Curtains twitched frantically in neighboring houses. Pale, wide-eyed faces appeared briefly in windows, only to vanish as if snatched back from the abyss. Children were pulled abruptly from sight. Doors slammed shut with frantic, desperate thuds. Locks turned with sharp, metallic clicks. The entire neighborhood held its collective breath, gripped by the kind of primal fear that spreads faster, more ferociously, than any fire. Martha stood frozen, a solitary, defiant figure framed in the doorway of her home, a lone woman against an encroaching army. The 20 men who had shared her fire the night before rose as one, a unified, unyielding front. They did not rush, did not panic, did not break. They stood, their heavy boots echoing with solid resolve against her wooden floors, and walked steadily, purposefully, into the blinding morning light. Their jackets, worn and scarred, caught the rising sun, their patches glinting, their colors bold and unyielding against the pristine white of the snow. Martha clutched the door frame, her knuckles white, as they stepped outside, 20 against what seemed like 200, or more. She feared for them, for their impossible bravery, feared for herself, for the fragile, nascent bond that had so unexpectedly bloomed in her quiet house. The circle of engines tightened further around the farmhouse, forming an impenetrable wall of steel and leather, a cage of power. The roar was deafening now, shaking the very windows, drowning out all coherent thought, all reason. And then, in the very eye of that sonic chaos, the 20 men, her men, formed a steadfast line before her porch. They stood tall, their shoulders squared with unwavering resolve, their faces solemn, almost grim. They were not cowering, they were not retreating. They simply stood, their collective presence a powerful, silent declaration of defiance, of loyalty, and of something Martha could not yet put a name to, something deeply ancient and profound. From her doorway, she watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, the entire world trembling with an overwhelming noise. And though she could not yet fathom the full meaning of this extraordinary spectacle, one thing was irrevocably certain. Dawn had not, as she had hoped, brought an ending. It had brought, instead, the tumultuous, undeniable beginning of something far, far greater. Martha gripped the door frame, her fingers splayed wide against the weathered wood, her chest tight with a cold, clenching dread. The profound vibrations of hundreds of idling engines coursed through her very bones, a chilling resonance. For a fleeting, piercing moment, a terrifying doubt clawed at her. Had she made a terrible, irreversible mistake the night before, inviting 20 leather-clad strangers into her secluded home without a moment's hesitation? Her kindness, once so certain, so intrinsic to her being, now felt like a gaping doorway to unimaginable danger. Her neighbors, unseen but palpable presences, gathered in the deep shadows of their homes, too paralyzed by fear to step fully outside. To them, the sight unfolding was nothing short of apocalyptic. An army, a tidal wave of black leather and gleaming chrome, pouring down their once peaceful narrow road, threatening to engulf everything in its path. Children were snatched back from frosted windows, their faces pressed against glass, then abruptly pulled away from the terrifying spectacle. Doors slammed and locked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, and whispers, sharp and breathless, cut through the nervous silence of homes, all carrying the same chilling warning. Asterisk, the widow has brought trouble to our town. And yet, amidst this terrifying chaos, the 20 men Martha had fed only hours earlier stepped forward from her porch. Their heavy boots struck the frozen earth not with arrogance, not with bravado, but with a quiet, unyielding defiance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs straight, their collective bearing as solid as ancient stone, as though bearing the crushing weight of 1,000 watchful eyes, 1,000 judgments. They did not cower. They did not attempt to explain. They simply waited, their faces etched with a grim resolve, as if prepared to face a final, irrevocable judgment. Then it happened. At the very front of that colossal wave of engines, amidst the forest of handlebars and gleaming steel, one man, larger and more formidable than the rest, lifted a single hand. It was such a small gesture, almost imperceptible against the overwhelming grandeur of the scene. But in an instant, a collective miracle occurred. The 1,000 engines obeyed. The thunder died, cut short in a perfect, breathtaking unison, leaving behind a silence so absolute, so profound, that it felt utterly unnatural. Birds dared not sing. Even the wind itself seemed to pause, caught in a suspended moment between fear and profound reverence. Martha felt her breath catch in her throat, a tight knot forming. Her heart, which had been racing wildly moments ago, now pounded with a heavier, more resonant rhythm, a beat of awe. She stared at the man who commanded such overwhelming power with a single, almost casual motion. His shoulders were broad, his presence undeniable, radiating an authority that filled the suddenly silent air. But it was his eyes that held her utterly still. Steady, unwavering, carrying not menace, but something else, something she couldn't yet name, something almost gentle. When he spoke, he didn't need to shout. His voice, deep and deliberate, resonated across the vast crowd, carried on the very silence itself, each word imbued with a profound weight. These men ride for me. The words hung heavy, undeniable, a declaration of absolute loyalty and power. Then he turned, his gaze fixed, unwavering, on Martha alone. And last night, he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, yet still carrying, you saved their lives. The immense weight of it crashed into her like a physical wave, leaving her breathless. Asterisk, saved their lives. Asterisk, she searched his face for meaning, for context, for some hidden riddle, but found no complexities, only a profound, unvarnished truth etched into every syllable. She had opened her home, her meager kitchen, her weary heart to men she had simply thought were forgotten wanderers. But now, she saw with sudden, terrifying clarity, there had been far more at stake than mere hunger or the biting cold. Before she could form a single word, a subtle rustle moved through the vast sea of bikers. One by one, helmets were lifted and carefully removed, revealing the faces beneath. The motion spread down the endless line, hundreds upon hundreds, until the entire street was alive with individual countenances, faces revealed to the pale morning light. Weathered faces, marked by the sun and wind of the open road. Scars, deep and ancient, carved by time and battles long past. Smiles, faint but undeniably genuine. Eyes, once sharp and wary, now softened by a profound, collective respect. Not strangers, not invaders. And then, as if guided by a single powerful will, 1,000 men bowed their heads. The gesture was not loud, not grand, no dramatic flourish, but the sheer, silent power of it nearly buckled Martha where she stood. The entire street, a vast ocean of humanity, seemed to bend towards her, a tide of reverence flowing into her small yard. Her knees weakened further, threatening to give out. The raw fear that had gripped her chest only moments ago dissolved, replaced by something so utterly unfamiliar she hardly knew what to call it. It was awe. It was humility. It was a staggering recognition that the moment before her was larger, more profound, than any she had ever lived. All along, she had believed she was merely feeding wanderers caught in the cold, showing a simple mercy to men long abandoned by a harsh world. But here, surrounded by their deep, respectful silence, by their collective deference, by the undeniable truth hidden within the leader's spare words, Martha finally understood how profoundly wrong she had been. She was never feeding strangers. She had, all along, been feeding family, though she had never, until this moment, truly known it. The moment stretched and held, impossibly, as if time itself had chosen to pause, to bear witness. Neighbors, who had once whispered nervous warnings behind their twitching curtains, now stood frozen at their windows, their fear replaced by stunned, wide-eyed disbelief. The street, which had so recently trembled under the thunderous roar of 1,000 engines, now trembled with something else entirely. The crushing weight of truth, the profound burden of revelation. And for Martha, that silence, 1,000 men standing, heads bowed, before her, spoke louder, resonated deeper, than any thunder ever could. Silence still held the crisp morning air, a silence heavy not with lingering fear, but with a profound, almost spiritual reverence. 1,000 men stood motionless, their heads bowed low toward the poor widow who had, with simple, open-hearted generosity, taken them in. Martha's hands trembled violently against the doorframe, her breath shallow, ragged, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had truly believed the night before was a simple act of mercy, the kind any woman of conscience might offer to those in need. But the immense weight of what stood before her now told a vastly different story, a story far grander, far more interconnected than she could have ever imagined. The leader, a figure of imposing authority yet now radiating a quiet humility, stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. In his eyes was no menace, no demand, only the deep, unvarnished weight of gratitude. carried by a brotherhood that had lived too long with hardened hearts, a code of honor now laid bare. He looked at Martha, frail in her doorway, her worn shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod, his voice low but carrying with the resonant power of a solemn vow. Years ago, he began, his gaze sweeping across his assembled men, then returning to her. When your husband was still alive, a brutal storm drove one of our own to this very door. He was cold, utterly empty, and felt entirely forgotten by the world. You gave him food, a warm blanket, a place to breathe, to simply be. You never even asked his name. Martha's brow tightened in concentration, a network of faint creases deepening. She searched the farthest, dustiest corners of her memory, straining to grasp the fleeting image, but the moment slipped through her like smoke, just beyond reach. The leader's eyes, steady and unwavering, lingered on her, his gaze an anchor. That man, he continued, his voice softening with unspoken meaning, was the one who coughed through the night last night, the one you cared for again with such unwavering skill, when no one else knew how. Her lips parted, a gasp of recognition catching in her throat. The memory, long dormant, flared to life, vivid and startling. A shivering figure at her table, long, long ago, the same pale face, now older, etched with experience, yet burning with the very same fever she had tended to the night before. She had forgotten him, utterly, but he had carried her kindness with him, a silent, powerful ember, all these intervening years. The leader's voice grew heavier, imbued with a deep sense of responsibility. Your kindness that day was never truly repaid. Last night, you saved him again, a second time, a profound, undeniable act of grace. And this time, his hand rose, a silent signal, and the gathered men stirred, a ripple of agreement passing through them. We will not ride away, owing you a debt. The first truck appeared before she could even begin to comprehend what was happening, rumbling forward with an engine sound distinctly different from the motorcycles, lower, heavier, a solid, purposeful thrum. In its bed were stacked immense bundles, tightly wrapped in tarps, hinting at unknown contents. Behind it came another, then another, a procession, until the quiet street, which had moments ago been empty save for the multitude of bikes, was filled with vehicles she hadn't even seen arrive. Neighbors craned their necks from windows, their faces etched with a profound confusion, unsure if they were witnessing a siege of unprecedented scale or a miracle unfolding before their very eyes. The leader raised his hand again, and the men began to move not recklessly, not with the aggressive swagger of invaders, but with a quiet, synchronized purpose. Some peeled away towards Martha's porch, carrying heavy envelopes that bulged with important-looking papers. Others strode with long, confident steps towards her sagging barn, their hands brushing along the warped, rotting wood as though already assessing damage only they could truly see. A few more disappeared around the side of her house, where the roof had long since surrendered its shingles to the ravages of time and weather. Martha gripped her shawl tighter around her, a protective, desperate gesture, her voice catching, barely a whisper in her throat. What? She managed to ask, her voice trembling. What are you doing? The leader's formidable gaze softened, a flash of unexpected warmth. Paying back a debt, he said simply, his voice firm, unequivocal, and with those few, potent words, the immense, overwhelming weight of what was unfolding began to settle, slowly but surely, upon her slender shoulders. Inside the envelopes were bank slips, crisp and official, stamped and signed with finality. Taxes cleared, property debts erased. Every dreaded notice, every chilling reminder of impending loss that had haunted her kitchen table for years, had been lifted, dismissed, as though by an unseen, benevolent hand. She opened one envelope, then another, her trembling fingers grazing the words she could hardly believe were real. Paid in full, stamped in bold, defiant red across documents she had carried like heavy, invisible chains for years. Tears, hot and sudden, filled her eyes, spilling over and blurring the blessed words on the papers. For so long, she had lived a life perched precariously on the edge, one missed payment, one late letter away from losing everything. Her land, her home, the last tangible pieces of her beloved husband's life. And now, with a single astonishing stroke of unexpected kindness, the unbearable burden was simply gone. But the angels, it seemed, were far from finished. The sharp, rhythmic clang of hammers against wood now echoed through the morning air. The protesting creak of ladders broke the profound quiet. Men swarmed across the dilapidated roof, their movements surprisingly agile, peeling away rotted shingles and laying down fresh, sturdy boards with the practiced precision of seasoned craftsmen. Others set to work on the ancient barn, reinforcing sagging beams, expertly patching holes where the relentless wind had howled for decades. One man, his powerful arms intricately tattooed with spreading, stylized wings, carried buckets of fresh paint and an array of brushes, whistling a low, tuneless melody as he carefully set them at her doorstep. The scene left the neighbors utterly speechless. Where once they had seen only menace and the intimidating anonymity of leather jackets, they now watched an army, not of destruction, but of meticulous rebuilding, dedicated restoration, and profound renewal. Even the children, whose faces had been pressed earlier to frosted glass in terror, now stared with wide, fascinated eyes at the miraculous transformation unfolding before them. Martha stood frozen, utterly overwhelmed, as the incredible scene unfolded around her. She had opened her door for warmth, offered a simple bowl of soup and a slice of bread. Now, men she had once feared with a primal instinct were replacing her broken windows, stacking firewood neatly and abundantly against her crumbling wall, filling her barren pantry with overflowing sacks of flour, sugar, and beans. Some had even led a pair of magnificent horses from the backs of the trucks, sturdy, healthy creatures that stamped their hooves against the frozen earth before being guided gently into her long empty stable. Everywhere she looked, hands that had once gripped roaring throttles and heavy chains now wielded tools with a quiet reverence, a meticulous care that belied their rough exteriors. They were not merely repairing a house. They were, with every deliberate hammer strike, every carefully placed board, every kind gesture, giving back a life. Martha's vision blurred with fresh tears, but through them, she saw it clearly vividly. The cracked, peeling paint of her walls, now restored to a pristine, hopeful white. The broken, forgotten fences, now mended straight and strong. The home that had felt like a tomb for so long, slowly, miraculously, becoming a sanctuary once again. More. It was more than mere charity, more profound than a simple good deed. It was a covenant, an unspoken pact forged not with the brittle permanence of ink on paper, but in the unwavering resilience of human action. These men had arrived not to instill fear, not to claim or diminish, but to bestow upon Martha something she had long believed irrevocably lost. A profound sense of security, an inherent dignity, and the comforting embrace of belonging. When the winter sun finally pierced the heavy veil of clouds, its burgeoning light did not merely illuminate an old widow's crumbling farmhouse. Instead, it bathed the place utterly reborn, shimmering with new life and purpose. And in the hushed reverence of that particular morning, Martha felt her husband's presence return, not as a familiar pang of sorrow, but as a swelling wave of pride. For the first time in 15 long solitary years, the chilling specter of tomorrow no longer held her in its grip. She had been given back far more than just her home. She had been given back her very life, a future imbued with hope. By mid-morning, the intricate symphony of labor had concluded. What had once been a weathered, forgotten farmhouse, teetering on the brink of collapse, now stood proud and resolute against the crisp winter sun. Its roof, once riddled with gaping holes, was now watertight and sturdy. Its fences, previously sagging and broken, stood perfectly straight, defining a cared-for space. Its walls, freshly coated, gleamed with the promise of renewed life. A plume of smoke curled gently from the chimney, no longer a solitary, almost mournful signal of one woman's isolated survival, but a vibrant banner, boldly proclaiming a life fully restored, a hearth rekindled. Martha remained on her porch, her worn shawl slipping effortlessly from her shoulders, as if she no longer required its threadbare comfort or its symbolic protection. Her gaze swept across the meticulously manicured yard, resting on the men who, without a word, had willingly taken her overwhelming burden and made it their own. Tools were systematically laid down, paint brushes meticulously rinsed, ladders carefully lowered. Then, as if guided by an invisible conductor, an unspoken command rippled through the gathering, and all 1,000 bikers turned in unison toward their waiting machines. Engines rumbled to life, a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through the crisp air, but there was no menace in the sound. Instead, it carried a profound reverence, a testament to the quiet power they had just wielded. The collective sound rolled across the entire town, not as a threat, but like a sacred hymn, sung in steel and fire, echoing the transformation they had wrought. One by one, with practiced ease, the men swung into their saddles, their polished chrome catching and refracting the morning light, the aged leather of their jackets and seats creaking softly as they settled. It was not a scene of chaotic departure. It was a perfectly orchestrated choreography, an army of riders moving with a singular, graceful purpose. Neighbors, who for years had peeked from behind closed curtains, now poured from their homes. They lined the street, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief, some with hands clasped tightly to their mouths, unable to comprehend the spectacle unfolding before them. Children, wide-eyed with wonder, clung to fences, their tiny fingers pressed against the cold wire as the endless procession of engines awaited its silent command, poised not to terrify, but to honor. The leader, a man of imposing stature yet gentle demeanor, approached Martha one final time. He offered no eloquent speeches, no elaborate ceremony, only a simple, profound nod, deep, deliberate, and carrying the silent, unspoken weight of 1,000 voices, a collective acknowledgement of her courage and their shared humanity. She met his gaze, returning it with a trembling smile, her tears catching the sun, glistening like tiny, precious jewels. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible lift of his hand, the majestic procession began. The first row of bikes crawled forward, their engines humming a low, steady tune. Their riders, clad in leather and chrome, each raised a gloved hand in a precise, silent salute as they passed her porch. Behind them, another row followed, then another, a seemingly endless river of roaring steel. The sound swelled, no longer the furious, disjointed roar of thunder, but a rolling, unified tide, steady and relentless, a living tribute carried forward on wheels. They rode past her newly restored home in perfect formation, a testament to their discipline and respect. Each man offered her the same gesture of profound regard, a silent language understood between them. Some offered a simple nod, a slight dip of the head, others raised 2 fingers from their handlebars, a salute reserved for those rare individuals who had earned more than mere words could convey. Martha stood tall, her former frailty completely forgotten, her figure framed with dignity against the gleaming, newly painted walls of her house. The gnawing fear of loss that had plagued her for so long had vanished. The powerful, rhythmic pulses of the engines washed over her, wave after wave, until the very air around her seemed to tremble with an almost sacred reverence. For the first time in 15 years, her neighbors did not gaze upon Martha with pity, did not see a lonely widow trapped in her silent grief. They saw a matriarch, resilient and strong, honored by an army. Her quiet act of kindness answered with a loyalty that transcended all measure. When the very last bike finally rolled past, disappearing over the distant rise, the street lay empty once more, save for the faint, lingering echoes of engines fading into the horizon, like whispers of a receding storm. But the silence they left behind was anything but hollow. It was rich and full, brimming with memory, with newfound promise, with the profound knowledge that for one magical winter's night, a forgotten widow had become the beating heart of 1,000 men. Martha did not feel forgotten again. She felt seen, truly seen, profoundly remembered, irrevocably alive. That night, as the house finally settled into its own quiet rhythm, Martha sat by her window. The moonlight spilled generously across the snow-covered landscape, painting the world in shades of silver and indigo, and for the first time in countless years, she wasn't afraid of the silence. She understood now that she was not alone, not in her lingering grief, not in her struggles, not in the vast expanse of her world. Somewhere out there, 1,000 engines continued to beat like distant tribal drums, carrying with them the indelible memory of her humble porch, the comforting warmth of her home, and the simple, enduring joy of her pancakes. On the small wooden table beside her armchair lay a single leather glove, a tangible emblem of their visit. The leader had left it there without a single word, resting it gently on her railing before he mounted his own imposing bike. She didn't know his name, and he hadn't asked for hers, but that glove was far more than a mere token. It was indeed a covenant. She closed her hand reverently over it and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared to articulate in years. It wasn't for herself, this time, but for the men who had so powerfully reminded her that kindness, once freely given, always finds its way home. Outside, the wind stirred the freshly fallen snow. The street lay still and deserted, but in her heart, Martha could still distinctly hear them, the low, steady hum of those engines, fading not into oblivion, but into eternity. It was a song she would carry within her forever. Because sometimes, the smallest act of genuine compassion, a warm meal on a bitterly cold night, can ripple outward, gaining momentum and power until it shakes the very ground beneath us, transforming not just a life, but an entire community. And perhaps that's the ultimate question we're left with, long after the engines have faded and the story has ended. If kindness could summon 1,000 engines for Martha, what might it, perhaps, summon for you? Be kind. If this story stirred your soul, share it with someone who needs to remember that compassion, truly, is never wasted. And if you'd like to hear more untold stories of ordinary people sparking truly extraordinary moments, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.